There are 108 deaths since 9/11 that are attributed to terrorism here in the US. So we've got 108 there. But there are 210,000 people who die in automobile crashes every year. And a third of these are attributed to poorly maintained roadways. So let's just think about that in perspective. This $4 billion, that's the MPPD budget. So the amount that DHS is kind of specifically putting into infrastructure protection, and that $64 billion is the overall DHS budget. Huge amount of money. But this $3.6 trillion, that is the unfunded amount of critical repairs that are needed to our roads, to our bridges, to our railroads, to our power structure. $3.6 trillion, and that's only the absolutely critical to make repairs. So we're going to start by looking at the critical infrastructure mission and talk about some of the fundamental issues that I've identified with it, get into wicked problems, so we're thinking critically, and then how I'd like to rethink the approach, how we all can rethink the approach. So starting with that, not everybody is a big infrastructure nerd. So what is the DHS infrastructure mission? Saying CI systems, so critical infrastructure systems, are so vital to the United States that their incapacitation or destruction would have a debilitating effect on security, national economic security, national public health and safety, or any combination. Debilitating effect on the nation. So there are 16, actually 17, critical infrastructure sectors. Just about everything. And there's a new one. As of last month, there's a 17th sector, federal and state elections and voting systems. So just think about that for a minute, and we're going to take a look at what DHS kind of describes as infrastructure protection. requires an integrated approach. Is everyone pumped for infrastructure protection now? Or is everyone confused? Because a crash on the highway, the bridge falling in 1930, the wildfire, how were those debilitating impacts to the nation? So getting to those sectors, this is the breakdown from a couple years ago of the 16 sectors. Obviously the 17th is not included. And you see huge pieces of the pie here. Commercial assets, 17,000 of the 80,000 infrastructure facilities. Government facilities, 12,000. Public health, 8,000. Huge things. Which one of those is critical to the entire nation? It causes a debilitating effect. This election site, so this is it's a brand new thing to think about. There are 113,000 polling locations across the country, and they're now critical infrastructure. What does that mean for us? Does everyone need a COOP plan? Does everyone need a protection strategy? Is this one-room schoolhouse in Briles, Kansas, essential to the nation now? It's one of those 113,000 election sites that's now that 17th sector. So here's my take. Most critical facilities are not attractive targets for terrorism. They either are not interested, it's too large, or it doesn't really meet their objective. And even if the terrorist does attack them, even if something happens, it is not going to cause a debilitating impact to the entire nation. So going back to the definition that the government uses, this facility is lost, the system's lost, it's not going to shut down the entire country. And a big part of that is because these are components of resilient systems. And then on top of that, the stuff is falling apart. These systems are physically crumbling on their own, and they're chronically underfunded. So getting into these CI systems as not being attractive targets for terrorists. So in 2004, Osama bin Laden, he said, all we have to do is send 2 mujahideen to the farthest point in the east, raise a piece of cloth on which is written Al-Qaeda, and the generals will race there. Terrorists don't need to even attack anything. They want to send messages. They want to get people riled up. They don't care about crumbling the country. So here's from the Global Terrorism Database, every cataloged attack that they have from 1960 through 2014 when I pulled this data. And the types of targets they've attacked are people, businesses, areas of easy opportunity. What they haven't targeted, so out of 130,000 attacks, 886 have been against telecommunications. Telecommunications is critical infrastructure as people think about it, but terrorists aren't really interested in attacking it. Transit, dams, these are not targets that terrorists have. They want easily accessible places. We've had 8 terrorist attacks in the US that have caused 100 and more fatalities or injuries. So this is the Pulse nightclub, the Twin Towers in New York, the Boston Marathon bombing. Anybody know this one in the upper right corner? The Dalles, Oregon. So there was a bio attack there in the 1980s, salmonella outbreak, sickened more than 100 people, attempt to sway an election. The Pentagon, the Olympic Park bombing in Atlanta, the crash site in Pennsylvania, and then Oklahoma City. Which one of these locations fall into that critical systems that will crumble the country, that'll have debilitating impacts on the nation? The Pentagon, maybe, except did that shut down the military? No, it actually grew it substantially. The Twin Towers, we're going to get into them in a minute. So these attacks were not against critical systems. So what these critical systems are facilities, services, systems, and they're the assets so vital, or the assets, systems, and networks so vital to the United States their incapacitation or destruction would have debilitating effects. That's a great definition. And so this definition had to come from somewhere. So as people were putting DHS together, they drew on what they knew about. So there had to be smart people thinking about infrastructure long before the creation of DHS. And it turns out there was this super smart guy. Anybody familiar with Colonel Warden? He was the commandant of the Air Command. He was the special advisor to the vice president. He wrote the book on air power. And so Colonel Warden came up with this idea, the enemy is a system, and he defined organic essentials as these pieces that are so important that even minor damage to essential industries may lead to the command element making concessions. Basically, Colonel Warden's organic essentials were the things that would cause a debilitating impact to the nation if they're destroyed. As we were forming DHS, we drew on the things that we knew about. These concessions lead to a collapse in the system. They make it physically difficult or impossible to maintain a policy or fight. And they have political and economic repercussions. They're too costly to bear. This sounds a lot like the way that we've been thinking about critical infrastructure. Colonel Warden's theory was around these concentric rings, that at the outside you have the field forces and the population, and at the inside you have leadership and the essential systems. The outside is very easy to target. You can get the perimeter, but it doesn't shut down the entire system. What you need is your air power to be able to target leadership, target those system essentials that are at the center, the very hardened point. Because attacking the periphery, yes, it kills and injures people, but it doesn't lead to those type of concessions. So Colonel Warden, in his theory, he had air power. The US has air power, and we can target the organic essentials within a country. So as we started to develop a Homeland Security strategy, we thought about the things that we would target as the targets that we would have here domestically. So we have adversaries, and they've said they're interested in targeting the US. But last time I checked, ISIS doesn't have aircraft carriers. ISIS does not have an entire wing of bombers, and ISIS doesn't have a huge ground force to follow up. So when you don't have any of these things, you can't target the center of those rings. All that you can target is the periphery. So when you think about Boston Marathon bombing, it's not an attack on critical infrastructure, it's an attack on that perimeter ring. So here's the first problem that I came across in the research. Strategic warfare, we know a lot about it. A lot of our leaders are educated from the years of military service, but it doesn't work as a counterterrorism strategy. Identifying a big list of targets and saying that we need to protect every one of them is not a realistic counterterrorism strategy. Even if these are attacked, ultimately, it doesn't matter that much because they don't cause a debilitating impact on the nation. So we're using the wrong measures of criticality. So on 9/11, it's interesting looking back at this. President Bush actually said this. He said, terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundations of America. These acts shattered steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. He basically said you can knock down 2 humongous buildings, you can hit the Pentagon, but that doesn't hit the heart of those concentric rings. Somehow we kind of lost sight of this, but that was the initial thought, on the day of the September 11th attacks. So the first sector that really jumped out at me in my research is commercial facilities sector. So commercial facilities sector has a number of subsectors: entertainment and gaming, which is casinos, lodging, outdoor events, public assembly, real estate, retail, sports leagues, and they're the biggest sector. This was that 30,000 of the 80,000. So we talked a lot about New York yesterday, but it's important to kind of revisit it in the light of that commercial facility sector. So this is Lower Manhattan in 1950. You can see what's not there yet. And the New York Stock Exchange was the most important place to be. So everybody had to be there to make the trades. There weren't any computers at this point, so you had everybody down there on the floor. And if you want to have a big successful brokerage, you've got to have all your people there together in the same building, as close to the stock exchange as possible. So what you need is some big buildings with big open floor plans. So in the 60s, they designed one, and they decided they needed 2 of them. And these were going to be the biggest buildings in Lower Manhattan. And they were going to be right by the brokerage houses, so everybody can be there together, trading and making money. The problem is, This got invented in the 80s. And all of a sudden, you needed to have a huge server room in your building. And you didn't need everybody on the same floor. And you didn't need everybody right next to the stock exchange. So it turned out that the large brokerage houses didn't need to be on Wall Street. And this is from the New York Times in 1994. There are these aging buildings that can't accommodate huge computers and a declining need for financial companies to be near each other. This street and its neighborhood are a mere reminder of what they once were. This is 1994, because there was a big problem in Lower Manhattan. The steady exodus of banks, brokerage houses, and insurance companies in recent years has left the capital of capitalism struggling at the very moment the economic system it epitomizes is sweeping the planet. 1996 in the Boston Globe. This is not the narrative that gets told very often. These buildings were not in good shape. There was 40% vacancy rate in the World Trade Center going into the late 90s. So this original World Trade Center, they were built in the 60s for a specific purpose, 13.4 million square feet of space, and by 1995, it had a 25% vacancy rate. That meant an entire 40-story building in Lower Manhattan was completely vacant. Well, what does that do to your property values? If you've got vacant space, everybody's slashing rates to keep up. So the average rent was only $47 per square foot right there in the 90s. Now, there was a drastic reset of the real estate market in Lower Manhattan that occurred in September 2001. There were also a large loss of life associated with that, but that's kind of glossed over in this. And I'm not going to touch on that because we're looking at this purely from kind of an economic standpoint and from kind of the bigger picture with this. So the drastic reset of office space occurred, and that led to complete redevelopment of that area. And it was all staggered. The buildings didn't all appear all at once so that they could be filled up one at a time and leased out. And the average rent now is $72.44 per square foot in brand new buildings that are optimized for the people that need them, LEED Platinum certified, and they're 100% occupied. So the original World Trade Center, that 14 million square feet, was bringing in an adjusted, so if we adjust for 2000 inflation, its maximum potential was $749 million a year. With the vacancy rate, it was less than 500 million. The new World Trade Center, which is 12 million square feet, it's bringing in $1 billion a year. So, substantial increase, doubled the value of an area where the New York Times and the Boston Globe said it's a shell of what it once was. Doesn't look like a shell anymore. So, David Rockefeller knows a lot about New York. He said, I think it's inevitable that the downtown, which is Lower Manhattan, will reinvent itself once again. The process is underway. He's optimistic about the future. They were not optimistic pre-9/11, but there wasn't anything that could be done about that. And then this is the marketing materials for the new World Trade Center. Say it's a stunning combination of modern design and super sustainable efficiency. Makes it a towering achievement. So now, out of the destruction of those original facilities, things that we might think were critical to the nation and would have those debilitating effects, Lower Manhattan has completely reinvented itself into an area that it couldn't have been without that great loss. So these debilitating impacts on the nation, back to all these different terrorist attacks, has that occurred? I don't believe that it has. But we've got a bigger problem, and that's crumbling infrastructure.
Infrastructure. It's our roads, bridges, dams, levees, airports, power grids, basically anything that can be destroyed in an action movie.
Get out of there! Damn it!
Holy shit! If an alien species judged humanity by our most popular movies, they'd think we were furious with asphalt all the time. The problem is, though, when our infrastructure is not being destroyed by robots and/or saved by Bruce Willis, we tend to find it a bit boring.
As you know, infrastructure is not a sexy or glamorous topic.
As much as I'd like to think otherwise, infrastructure is not sexy.
Infrastructure is not very sexy.
Yes, infrastructure, like those men we just heard from, is important but not sexy. Although, to be fair, that may just be because Hollywood promotes unrealistic standards of infrastructure beauty. That's not what a real road looks like. Real roads have curves. So most people think infrastructure is boring. They think it's boring, but is it? Because I'd argue that it's actually pretty fascinating. And I know that in saying that, I've basically become the rad youth counsellor trying to convince you that Jesus was the Taylor Swift of his time. Revelations is a breakup song to the Romans, guys. Who wants another Mountain Dew? Catch. So let's talk about infrastructure tonight. And let's begin with dams, because dams are amazing. They're the most powerful device we have for holding back liquid, aside from the idea of using a porta potty. I'll wait. I'll just wait forever. I cannot go in there. America used to love dams.
Grand Coulee Dam in Washington State, the world's biggest concrete structure.
Boulder Dam stands today, a modern colossus.
The walls of the new dam tower into the sky like mighty modern pyramids.
Yes, and we built those dams with ingenuity and brawn and, of course, piles and piles of dead Irish. Of course we did. They're good workers and their corpses make a solid foundation material. That's an architectural fact. But these days, America's once great dam system is in a state of serious disrepair.
The average age of the country's 84,000 dams is 52 years, and many of them have problems that stem from when they were first built.
Yes, much like most Botox recipients and competitive cloggers, the average dam is 52 years old and probably has something deeply broken inside of it. You would think a statistic like that would terrify people into action, but amazingly, many states are paying virtually no attention to their dam problems.
In 2007, the last year for which statistics are available, Texas had just 7 inspectors responsible for 7,400 dams. That's over 1,050 dams per inspector. The state was only able to look at 239 dams. Alabama doesn't even have an inspection agency to monitor its 2,000+ dams.
0 inspectors. That means that the state of Alabama has exactly the same number of dam inspectors as the band Alabama. And it's not just dams. We're currently doing a terrible job of maintaining all of our infrastructure.
The nation's infrastructure of bridges, roads, and pipelines is sorely in need of renovation.
Collectively, they get nothing more than a D+.
A D+. Think about that. America got the same grade that a 10th grade teacher gives a nightmare kid so she doesn't have to deal with him for another year. No.
Yes, so a D. That's the grade on our infrastructure report card from last year. We do have a B- in solid waste. So we're doing a good job at piling up trash, but most of these other areas, not so great. Any of my California folks, where's this? Yeah, it's Orville, and the water's not supposed to come out of the left side, but it's spilled over and created this giant geyser. They thought that a wall of water was potentially going to wash away part of the Central Coast. Evacuated 188,000 people. But back in 2005, an environmental group sued the government, saying that you need to improve this spillway on this dam, and they tried to block the recertification of the facility. People knew that the dam was inadequate with the spillway that was there, but there's not an interest in investing in any of these things. It was designed in the 50s, it was completed in 67, and now we have this geriatric phase of infrastructure. So Bob Bay, who's a civil engineer at UC Berkeley, said a 50-year-old person isn't as robust as a 16-year-old, and neither is a 50-year-old dam. So our infrastructure is in that geriatric phase. It would be far more cost-effective to be proactive and fix these things up front. David Freiberg, associate professor at Stanford, said that basically that damage at the Orville Dam is like if a couple cables on the Golden Gate Bridge broke. It wouldn't be catastrophic, the bridge isn't gonna fall, but you gotta fix it, and it's gonna be really expensive to fix. And you gotta keep an eye on it. So that's the way that we're treating a lot of these critical systems. 56,000 American bridges are structurally deficient. That's a big deal. So in DC, where I'm from, the Memorial Bridge, it's going to be closed in 2021 unless there are $250 million in repairs to it. This is what the bottom of the bridge looks like. This is not only a main commuter route in DC, but this is also a critical part of the DC evacuation plan. And this is what the bottom of it looks like. Just to repair the steel is $90 million, and that's just extending the lifespan of the bridge. But bridges have collapsed. I-35 bridge collapsed. It killed some people. The DC metro system, due to poorly maintained sensors in the tracks, 2 trains crashed into each other. Luckily, it wasn't at rush hour. It killed every single person in the first and last car of the trains. It happened at 2 in the afternoon when there were only 16 or 17 people on them. Even things that we think we care a lot about and seem to think a lot of money goes into, like a football stadium, the roof still collapses because money never went into repairing it and maintaining the system over time. We have chemical facilities that are poorly maintained, and they spill toxic waste into the only waterway serving a community in West Virginia. We have power stations that fail. This was up in Washington. We have municipal water systems that are completely contaminated. Levees that flood towns, water mains that break every single day in every major city across the country, and even people visiting Disney World can fall into sinkholes because the loose ground had poor foundations that was constructed with these buildings. And then there's a lot of stuff we don't need anymore, and we just tear it down. So casinos, sports stadiums, sometimes they fall down intentionally. But since we have to touch on politics, and Todd let us know why it's really important to have a much more substantial southern border, despite all those things that are falling to pieces and all those critical repairs that are needed, we're looking at about $15 billion to build a wall. So all of this, these are problems that seem obvious, but they're not problems that are being solved. And part of that is these are wicked problems. And the wicked problems, which we all love to talk about in class here, are the ones that are difficult or impossible to solve. And that's because either there's incomplete or contradictory knowledge, we know pieces, but we can't put the whole puzzle together. There are too many people and opinions involved. That's probably the number one piece on the infrastructure mission, because everybody has a different stake in it. An engineer has an entirely different interest in infrastructure than a local politician or somebody in the federal government. A large economic burden. Going back to that $4 trillion in critical repairs, where are we going to get $4 trillion from? We don't have it. And then all these problems are interconnected. So that is why infrastructure is a wicked problem. And its issues here are really rooted in the unbalanced scale here. So what we don't have is investment, and we don't have a multi-decade vision for how we're going to fix infrastructure. But what we have a ton of is underfunding, overuse, and shifting priorities. Just like adding a 17th sector, we always have something new to focus on. There's no money to do it. But there is a place where they have figured out a solution to a wicked problem. And so Lutong Katon is wealth follows the extension of motorways. And that's the saying that is driving in China right now.
China is about halfway done building the largest expressway system in the world, and it's been doing so at a feverish pace over the last 25 years to keep up with the rise of the automobile as the country and the world has shifted away from a rail-based transportation system. The first expressway within the National Trunk Highway System, as it's called, opened in 1988, and today, just 26 years later, the system is over 65,000 miles long. In the 10 years since 2004, the network has tripled in length. Each year, China is now building new expressways equivalent in length to the distance of going coast to coast and back in the United States. The Chinese system exceeded the total length of the US interstate highway system back in 2011. This crazy expansion has happened because the Chinese have embraced the car at a staggering pace. This next mind-blowing fact pretty much sums up this entire video. As the country's middle class boomed and tens of millions of people suddenly could afford to buy cars in the 20 years from 1985 to 2005, the number of passenger vehicles in China increased from 19,000 to 62 million cars on the road. That's a mind-blowing increase of 323,000%. And that 62 million number is more than tripling to 200 million by 2020. That's why we've seen those stories that I thought were a joke the first time I read them, of traffic jams around Beijing stretching over 60 miles and lasting for 11 days. So this project is sorely needed simply for the country to function. When it's finished, it'll have cut total travel times between cities throughout the country by half on average. Overall, the total cost of building the entire system is $240 billion. That's easily the biggest infrastructure project in human history, with $12 billion a year being invested through 2020. It's being able to afford to do this without adding a national fuel tax, because 95% of the system are toll roads owned by private for-profit companies. This is a problem, as tolls are expensive at over 10 cents per mile, which is more than the cost of fuel itself. But regardless of how the roads are paid for, or whether you drive in them in your gas or electric car, or ride in a self-driving car in the future, the Chinese economy and quality of life of its people will be significantly better thanks to this ambitious project. It seems the whole country is embracing the Chinese saying, Lutong Kaiton, wealth follows the extension of motorways.
So substantial investment by the Chinese looks a lot different from a lot of our roadways and the amount of funding that's going into them. But there's a path forward. So the good news is, even if we're not funding it or taking care of it or doing anything to invest in the future of it, there's a lot of existing resiliency within our systems. So these disruptions that happen, even when they're significant disruptions, they don't break the systems. Any ideas on what's here? The beaver dam. So beavers are nature's engineers, and they build dams, and the dam stops up a creek, and it creates a pond. And the pond has fish and birds and so on, and it creates this nice little forest ecosystem. The thing is, the beaver gets eaten by a coyote, or it dies of old age, or it drowns, or a big flood comes, and the beaver dam breaks. And when the beaver dam breaks, it leaves a big mess behind it. So that pond that was here drains away, and there's a bunch of debris, all the fish die, all the birds fly away, and you end up with this spot in the forest. The thing is, that beaver dam and that pond become a beaver meadow. So the beaver meadow has all of that super rich soil from the pond and everything that decayed and fell into it. All of the trees that had rotted while it was a pond, and the root systems that eroded have fallen, and you have this clear space of super rich, nutrient-rich soil, and that creates a whole new growth area in the forest. So that's an opportunity for new trees to develop, and it's a critical part of the forest ecosystem to have that renewal. So out of that destruction of the beaver dam, you have a new opportunity for growth. That sounds kind of like what happened on 9/11. We had a big tragedy, we had a big disaster. It was not what anybody planned, but out of that, there has been a tremendous regrowth and rebirth out of opportunity. That's one of the things we need to look at and focus on because it's happening everywhere. So again, kind of the literal beaver dam breaks here in New Orleans and it wreaks havoc on the city. But if anybody who's been to New Orleans recently, it's beautiful. It's better than it ever was because there is the opportunity for regrowth that comes out of this destruction. The I-35 bridge in Minneapolis, it collapsed. There's a substantially better bridge there. New York City, we talked extensively about the flooding yesterday from Sandy, but people were still able to get around. The city was back in business. In Flint, Michigan, the municipal water system was unusable. We have a lot of bottled water, and we have a lot of people that can help deliver it. We have systems to be able to provide those essential services, even when there are disruptions. And this is a planned demolition. In Las Vegas and Atlantic City, they've been blowing up casinos, but the revenue is up in both of those cities because they had too many. So it becomes very complicated. Fire stations closed due to funding, but units respond from other stations. Greensburg, Kansas, when it was totally wiped out by the tornadoes in 2008, they're rebuilding it as an entire LEED Platinum city that's 100% sustainable. Out of that destruction came a new opportunity that you wouldn't have had otherwise. So one of the solutions that I offer, we talked about a whole lot of problems, is that if we designate something as critical, it needs to meet that definition of criticality. We need to take a hard look at if it is really going to be so vital to the United States that its incapacitation or destruction has a debilitating effect. We need to take a hard look at every one of these facilities that seems important and think, does it really fit this definition? So I was driving out between Colorado and New Mexico last month. I was going from Denver to Taos Ski Valley, and I thought there's a big problem with my theory. So I'm driving and I come to this huge river gorge over the Rio Grande, and there's this giant span bridge across there. And looking at this 300-foot gorge and this bridge, I'm thinking this bridge is really important. If something were to happen to this bridge, I have no idea how we would get to Taos because I've been driving down 2-lane roads for hours. So I thought, the bubble's gonna burst right here. I've been totally wrong about this. But I decided to put an alternate route into Google Maps just to see what would happen. And even if that bridge was out, I could still get to Taos Ski Valley. It was gonna take an extra 45 minutes, but I'd still be able to make it. Because when you really look at all of the alternatives, not any single thing matters that much. Part of why that infrastructure list became so huge is people have been allowed to self-evaluate and deem themselves to be critical. So we need to have a methodology for evaluating infrastructure, and it needs to align with that mission of protecting the nation against terrorism. The types of facilities and how they're designated need to align with that core mission. So thinking about dams, there's a lot of money that goes into site security plans and CCTV and all sorts of things. What would it take to blow up this dam? How many tractor trailers full of AMFO would you need to park on top of it to actually do any meaningful damage? It turns out you just need a lot of rain in Northern California. You don't even need terrorists. But the point is that these systems are enormous. The ones that really matter are too big for any terrorist group to target. What's not too big is our transit systems that are grossly overused and overcrowded and overfunded. And this is what rush hour looks like on a bad day in the DC Metro. And you can imagine what an IED or a backpack with an explosive would do to this crowd, but it doesn't happen, and it's never happened, because that's not a target that makes sense in terms of infrastructure protection. And then lastly, our protection strategies, they need to account for the existing resiliency and the unexpected outcomes within these ultra-complex systems. So we can't just say, if this facility gets destroyed, if this power plant's taken offline, it's gonna be terrible. we've got to think about all of those unexpected consequences. What happened in Lower Manhattan when you had a destructive event? It's been rebuilt into a sustainable neighborhood that's now an economic capital when it had been in bad shape in the late 90s. New Orleans, destructive event, but it's in better shape than it's ever been. So the unexpected outcomes make this extraordinarily complex. Lower Manhattan again. And this is the biggest piece, is we need to shift from an inclusive policy that allows people to self-designate and self-assess risk. And we need to have a policy that assumes that facilities are inconsequential to the entire nation unless you can prove otherwise. Right now, if you get to say you're critical and you put a bunch of 5s on your scorecard that you send to DHS, you can join the list and you can be part of the infrastructure protection family. It should be the opposite. You need to prove that your facility matters to the entire nation, and then that can give us that list of facilities and systems to really focus on. Because the Thurston County Fair in Washington is a great time and it's really important and it does a lot for the local economy, but it's not a national priority. And things like this need to come off the infrastructure protection mission.